or more broadly polymer clay, but specifically we'll be doing Sculpey. Although all the tips and tricks and stuff we're going to be learning applies to all of the rest, but I just happen to use Sculpey, so that's what we're going to be using for this class. So first of all, let's talk about the material a little bit, and by the end of this particular lesson we're going to have blocked out a little figurine head, and in subsequent lessons we'll be going over the very specific things like how to make a nose, how to make an eye, etc., etc. And then at the end we'll be doing stuff like doing wrinkles and veins and pores and all that kind of fine detail, making texture stamps and cool stuff like that. So before we get started though, let's look at some of the stuff that I've made with Sculpey so that you get a sense for the kind of stuff that it's good for. So there's like dolls, creatures, maquettes, pretty much anything organic it's great for. Small to medium size sculptures. Once you get above about a foot or two tall, it's not the best material because it's kind of fragile, and baking it becomes problematic. And if you're doing technical stuff, if you're making a car or a robot, probably not the right material. But if you want to make cool creatures or people or fairies or that kind of stuff, great stuff. So there's a couple different kinds of Sculpey out there. There's this regular Sculpey, and it's this white crumbly stuff, and I don't use it for anything. I've tried using it as kind of the core of a sculpture because it's way cheaper than the other Sculpey, but it just ends up being more trouble than it's worth. Then there is Super Sculpey, and this is the stuff most people are familiar with. It's pink, it's semi-translucent, so it's got a very natural kind of fleshy tone to it, you know, if you're pink fleshy, I guess. Then there's Sculpey 3, which is, or Sculpey III. I don't know what they intended with that. I call it Sculpey 3. And this stuff comes in a lot of different colors. I think it's marketed more for making beads and jewelry and stuff like that. And it's pretty close to Super Sculpey, maybe a little bit harder than it, or more firm, I should say. And then finally there's Sculpey Firm, which comes in these big bricks. I don't know why. I wish they would make it like the other stuff where you could break it off easier, but this stuff is significantly more firm. It's completely opaque, which is nice for seeing details, and well, you could just make it more detailed than Super Sculpey or Sculpey 3 a little bit. So those are the main kinds. The techniques that I'm showing work for all of them. I encourage you to just experiment, see what you like best. If you're doing one-of-a-kind dolls, like there's a lot of people who make fairies and stuff like that, they use the Super Sculpey because their skin tone, assuming they're making, you know, Caucasian fairies, is already mostly there, and they just have to paint little highlights and stuff. I tend to use the Firm. I like the detail that I can get with it. I don't squish parts of it as easily when I'm working. The downside is it takes a bit longer to get going with it because you really have to knead it for quite a while before it's soft enough to be workable. Depending on the batch you get to, right? Sometimes it's really soft and nice and smooth, and other times you just have to spend a lot of time kneading it, and that's no fun. And there are other brands of polymer clay that all have a variety of different consistencies. There's Cernit and Fimo, and there's this specific doll making stuff. I can't remember the name. There's several doll making ones. Basically, it's all polymer clay. You're not going to shoot yourself in the foot by getting one brand over the other when it comes to just the basics and learning the material. Okay, let's go over tools. So every artist that I know tends to use one tool about 90% of the time, and then have little backups for specialty things. So for me, it's this one. This is kind of a wax carving tool, and it's got a kind of a thin paddle on one end and a thicker one, and I use this for almost everything. Other people I know, better artists than me, use a toothpick, and some people use popsicle sticks and little rubbery nubbery things and whatever the heck this is. So the point being, use whatever you've got. I'm going to use what I'm familiar with, and you'll find what you have has advantages and disadvantages, and it really just comes down to taste. So again, don't sweat it, use what you got. I'm going to put links to all the tools that I use so that you can buy them if you want to follow along precisely with what I'm doing. So polymer clay starts out in this as a soft kneadable stuff, more or less soft. You bake it in the oven at a low temperature, usually around 230 to 250 degrees for half an hour or an hour, depending on how thick it is. And it comes out, and after 15 minutes of cooling down, it's nice and hard. However, it's also fragile, so you really have to treat it almost like fine china when it comes out. Because of that, it's that's why it's great for like things that are going to sit on your shelf and not be moved around a lot. It's not so good for making toys or prototypes or things. Another thing to consider when you're designing whatever it is you're going to make, in this case we're going to make a head, you don't want super thick pieces and then super thin pieces, because the baking time is different for each. I mean, having little fingers and then maybe like up to half an inch of clay is fine. You just want to heat it up slowly in the oven, let it cool down for a long time. But if you have like a solid ball of Sculpey, it's going to take forever to cook through. It'll have to go really hot, and then if you have fine little details, those could snap. So we're going to be making a head. The first thing we're going to do is make an armature for it. And what I tend to use is aluminum foil. So aluminum foil is great because it's very cheap, it's easily malleable, and those are the only reasons. Okay, so we're going to make a head. Now, one of the issues that especially a lot of beginners run into is getting the proportions right is very difficult. So I came up with this little idea. I don't know, probably other people have done it too, but I've never seen it before. So I'm going to walk you through this. That I think almost anyone can do this. So what I did was I just went on the interwebs, I Googled head proportions, and I found a picture that's got, surprise, head proportions. So I printed it out at the size that I want it to be, and what I'm going to basically do is make a little template that I could stick my ball of clay in and see if it's the right proportions. So now the way I'm going to do this, I'm taking some thick paper. You could use cardstock. I'm using this thin cardboard. And what I'm basically going to do is make a shape around the head. Let's see, make sure I'm using the completely flat part. And I'm just going to shape the cardboard so that I've got a template. Also, it does not need to be that thick. I'm using hot glue. You could also just use tape. The neck kind of makes it difficult to see the side shape of the skull that I'm trying to get. It's always super handy to have a three-dimensional model here. But this is essentially what I'm going to be starting out with. So it's kind of a ball for the head part, and then this kind of face hangs off. So one thing I'm going to do is take a, I'm going to follow the jawline up and then go around like that. And then the neck will stick in later, but it's really helpful to have that jawline defined for you. Okay, for the armature for the head, I'm using armature wire. This is aluminum wire, but you could use literally anything that sticks out of it, like a popsicle stick or a paper clip. Making a little candy cane shape so that when it hooks into the aluminum foil brain, it's not going to pull out on accident. So generally I try to keep my Sculpey less than ½ an inch thick all the way around. So see, if I filled this solidly with Sculpey, it would be about 1.5 inches from here to here. That's just way too thick. So that's the point of this little aluminum foil brain that I'm making. It doesn't have to be huge, it just has to be enough so that it separates the material all the way around it. One thing I find is that if you get too aggressive with the armature and bulking it out with foil, you always end up biting yourself in the butt and having to go back and remove material or push it around and stuff. And so I tend to be kind of a minimalist, that's the word, when it comes to armatures. Now, with the Sculpey, especially the Sculpey firm, you kind of have to break it into little pieces and then knead it to get it soft enough to start working with. One thing you can do, like I mentioned earlier, you could use cheaper Sculpey like the regular white Sculpey and do a layer around it. Only do that though, again, if you're super sure you're not going to need to carve down into that. Otherwise you get inconsistent surface qualities and it's just kind of annoying. So the first couple layers, I don't worry about getting them super soft and malleable because they're just going to be covered up anyway. Cut a little hole here so that as I'm expanding my clay I can stick the armature through there. Oh, one thing I should mention for those new to polymer clay, when you leave your clay down on a piece of paper, it will, after a couple hours, it will leave an oil splotch there, so don't leave it on books or anything that's important to you. Also, plastic, don't put it on your laptop or anything plastic because it will kind of merge into it. Okay, so you can see we got pretty much the profile blocked in pretty well. Now we have to work on making it symmetrical and getting the front view working. Now, one thing a lot of beginners are usually surprised by is how gross and lumpy and weird the beginning stages are. And the reason it is that way, the reason that it doesn't look like a nice finished piece from the beginning, is because fundamentally the first thing you have to worry about when you're sculpting a 3D volume is the mass of it, is the forms. And if you don't get that very big, gross volume figured out first, no amount of details are going to save it. It's always going to look weird if you don't get that down. And so by not focusing on the details at all, by specifically not thinking about them, that helps to make sure that the masses are in there correctly. And so that's why I'm just plopping on these lumps and bumps everywhere, just because I'm trying to get the symmetry, I'm trying to get the overall balance of the head figured out first. There are a few key landmarks that need to be hit at this point, and one of them is this jaw line here. So that's why you see how I'm pushing my thumbs together like that? I'm reinforcing those lines over and over again. I'm adding stuff, I'm squishing it around, and it kind of gets lost, and then I go back in and squish it back into place. And having this template is really nice because even though I'm squishing it around and distorting it, I can always get it back into place using that little wall. Okay, so at this point we have a blocked in rough head for a humanoid, and this would work for any humanoid, for a male or female, a fairy, an orc, whatever. From here, it's time to start defining what kind of character it is we're going to make. Now, I just chose one off the internet. I found this pretty cool looking dude. It's like, hey, that dude should be sculpted. So that's what I'm doing. Ignore these wrinkly guys for now. We'll get to that at a future lesson. But for now, what I want to look at is his general proportions and shape. You know, when you look at any face, there are a few things that jump out at you. These are the kind of things that caricature artists will pick up on. You know, if you've got a bulbous nose, they'll make your nose very bulbous. And if you've got, like this guy, he's got this super square jaw and like big chin. So if a caricature artist was doing him, he would, you know, look like those cartoon characters who have giant chins. So looking at this, I can already see that he has a fairly slender face proportionately. He's not round faced at all. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the piece, and I try to always use both hands at the same time. That way you maintain your symmetry easier. And I'm just kind of gently squeezing the bottom to kind of pull the face, elongate the face out more. I'm not worried about the nose, about the eyes, about the mouth. None of that. It's just the overall forms of his head. It doesn't help that he's got this big turban on, but you know, we can fudge that detail. It's really cool to have multiple angles too, but in this case, this is just kind of a learning piece, so it's not super important to mimic something exactly. Just going for a general feel here. Okay, and now it's only at this point where I feel it's safe to put on a neck. When you put on the neck before you have the overall form of the head and jaw, that stuff is a lot harder to get the landmarks down exactly where they need to be. When you're blocking in the neck, you want to make sure that you don't go past the jaw. You want to make sure that jawline is still clearly visible. Okay, so at this point, we've got everything roughed in to where we're ready to start adding features to the face. Well, not yet, actually. First, we want to get rid of all the cracks and crevices and lumps and bumps, because this is the point at which it starts to become distracting. So you need a surface to work from. And so to do that, basically exactly the same thing I was doing before. I'm just squeezing the pieces much thinner. I'm making sort of a skin that I can patch over. One thing to note, when you're doing this kind of finishing work, or smoothing, we'll just call it smoothing work. When you're doing that, don't hold your statue like this, because when you do that and you start smoothing on this side, everywhere that your fingers are touching are putting dents in there. So try to hold it with your palm to distribute the weight across a larger surface of your hand. As I'm smoothing, I'm being careful not to smooth over important lines. So right now, the important line is the jawline. So to keep from losing that, I'm putting my thumb where the line is and then smoothing down to it, and that actually gives me a nice crisp line. One thing to remember about sculpting in general is it's much easier to smooth down overly crisp lines and edges than it is to define an area that got too mushy, because you need to be really careful, especially early on, of losing the important landmarks. Let me give you an example. A lot of artists do this technique, and I've kind of experimented with it on and off. Here's a bust that I'm doing of my wife, and it's kind of halfway done. But you can see on this side, this is how I started it, was this very faceted, almost robotic look. And that's because I was really trying hard to make sure that all the planes and proportions were in the right place. You can see on this side I've started smoothing it down some. It's not done yet, but yeah. Incidentally, if you want to see 10 minutes of my wife acting like a computer, click this link. Now, I was thinking that smoothing a surface with a clay rake is maybe a intermediate level thing because of the tools required and stuff like that. But it just occurred to me that I could probably get away with something really similar with just a butter knife. So, hold on one second. Let me try something. Okay, I'm going to give this a whirl. If it doesn't work, then I'll edit it out. But essentially, what raking does for clay is, even though it makes the surface really rough, what it actually does is, once you smooth it down, is gives you nice, sharp, flat planes to work with. Something that you're always going to be battling when you're making organic shapes like faces and such is the topology of the surface. It's kind of divoted and lumpy. No matter how much you smooth it with your fingers, there's going to be unevenness. So I got this serrated just butter knife, and I'm going to try this. Let's see if it works. Yeah, that actually seems to be working pretty well. So what you can see is that, I mean, besides making all these boogers on the surface, what it's doing is it's tearing down all of the peaks on the clay. Like if you can imagine if you were a flea on the surface of this and you're in a little valley, what this is doing is scraping away all the hills that are around you until eventually it just turns into one nice flat plane. And that's what we really want, is a very smooth, flat surface to start from. And then I'm just rubbing my finger over it to get all those little bits off. At the bottom of the chin too. See, I'm varying the direction it goes as well. That helps to make sure that you're getting even coverage. You can see here I've got this dent where I must have been, working on it over here, and my finger was pressed up against there, and that really chaps my hide. So I gotta go back, rub it down, even it out. Okay, so before we go and smooth this down, take a really good look at it from multiple angles and try to make sure that you've got symmetry. You know, look at it from the bottom and look at the arc of the chin. Is that symmetrical? Look at it from the top looking down. Is the curve of the face symmetrical? Is the bulbous back of the head, is that symmetrical? Look at it straight on. Does it look like the curve falling off is about the same? Flip it back and forth, look at that jawline, does that look about the same? Now it's super important when it comes to faces. Faces are not flat, okay? And that's a typical beginner's mistake, is to kind of start with a flat plane and then you do the eyes and the nose and the mouth and then you do the side of the face flat. The whole face from, you know, the back of the jaw to the other back of the jaw is a big U. So you got to make sure that that curve follows all the way through. That's pretty neat. I've never taught a beginner's class raking, but I feel pretty good about that. Just using a butter knife works fine. The trick is when you're going back in and getting rid of the rake lines is to just be delicate with it. Make sure again that you're holding the back of it in the palm of your hand and that you're not gouging into the clay as you smooth it. Definitely using a delicate touch. Better to go over the same surface 10 times with a soft touch than one time with a too heavy touch, and then you end up with a dent, and then you got to go back and do all the raking or filling it in with more clay. So this is the part where patience certainly pays off. Alright, you don't have to get super obsessive with worrying about these lines, because virtually none of this surface that you see now is going to be the surface of the finished piece. It's just very important to have a smooth, symmetrical starting point to place all your features on top of. If it's lumpy, bumpy, and off-kilter at this point, again, doesn't matter how perfect your details are on all the pieces that sit on top of it, it's going to look like Sloth from Goonies. Okay. So let's start deciding where our landmarks are going to fall now. And for that I've got an idea. Okay, so we're just going to use the same diagram we've got. If you were smart and thought ahead, you may have printed out 2 copies of this. Oops. I may still have to do that. Let's see. It'll probably work for what I need. So, first thing you do is you make a line that goes straight down the middle. So, just kind of carefully use a long tool. It can be a sculpting tool like this, and you can draw it gently. You can use a toothpick. Lay it out and just kind of rock it back and forth till you get that center line in. And then you look for the halfway mark. The eyes land halfway between the chin and the very top of the head. It varies from person to person a little, so you don't have to be precise, but you know, hopefully you've got reference. Please have reference. In my case, my dude's like perfect supermodel, so I'm sure he has the perfect, exactly eyes 50% of the way. And then once you have that, you can take your paper, your little printout, and line it up. So mine's all kind of ripped and distorted, so that doesn't help, but yours won't be because you'll have watched this first. and printed out 2 copies. Yeah, so once it's there, you can just kind of press in your landmarks. So you know you're going to want eyes there, your nose there, side of your